This is part one, how bias impacts our relationships with children and families, as part of our series alongside Peach. And in a moment, I'll explain more about that. But we are incredibly excited to be here with you all today. And I'm here myself, Christina Espinosa. We have Cindy Steffens, Elmida Baghdaserians, and Michelle DeJohnette joining us today for our English webinar. In today's webinar, what are we hoping to do? We're going to be covering some key terms around anti-bias. We're also going to share about the research and the examples of bias in our programs, and families. And we're also going to talk about what we can do as individuals, as early educators, and in our relationships with families and in our programs, really. So that's going to be a really enriching conversation for us, because we're going to be offering it in a discussion panel, and then we'll offer resources as well. As you might know, with any webinars that you might have been with me, I seek to offer resources that make the transition from trainings into implementation like that much smoother. In our group agreements, we usually have some pretty fundamental ideas like respect ourselves, respect each other in the space. We might be familiar with those usually, right? But this series being more complex and delicate, as I mentioned earlier, we decided to take a different approach. And so as we embark in these courageous conversations with ourselves and others, we're going to ask for these key group agreements. And then I will invite you all to share any additional group agreements that you would like to add to enhance our environment. So before I share, think about what helps you feel welcomed, included, and like your voice matters. So our group agreements will be to listen with respect and an open mind, assume best intentions in ourselves and in others who are speaking and sharing. We're going to stay engaged to the best of our ability. We're going to speak our truth, whatever truth that might be, while also recognizing conciseness is helpful. We're going to expect and accept a lack of closure. And so I really want to drive this point home. Racism, bias, prejudice, all of these topics that we are embarking on here in these conversations, they do not have black and white simple answers. They do not have clean solutions. And so it could be we do a great job of answering your questions or concerns. And it could be maybe we need additional support and more conversations. So we're going to do the best we can, and understand that attending this webinar and learning what we learned today and trying it in program is not going to solve everything, but it is an important and valuable step. And lastly, discomfort leads to growth. So in creating this safe space, there are going to be moments where we feel uncomfortable, whether that's physically uncomfortable or emotionally uncomfortable. And I invite you to expect that, but also recognize it's temporary. We can support you if needed. We have this space to do it, what you need to do. But also recognize that discomfort is what can help us reflect, what, I'm uncomfortable because this matters. I'm uncomfortable because I'm not sure how to approach this. I'm uncomfortable because I might have something inside me, some thoughts or biases or prejudices that I didn't realize. And now it's an invitation in my mind and my heart and soul to reflect and see what I can do and manage that discomfort. Okay. Would anyone like to add any agreements? Do we have any? If you could share in the chat, and I can invite one or two folks to share on the mic. Do we want to add any group agreements? Melanie shares that she likes that I say brave space instead of safe space. Melanie, I agree with you. I more recently found out about this term in June in a conference, and the poem and how it highlights that safe spaces do not exist, that just sort of shook me. So I'm grateful that we are moving this direction of being more real. Like, no, the world is hard, and a training environment is part of that world too. Anyone else? Do we have any other group agreements we want to touch on? Okay, feel free to give me a thumbs up if you like and want to continue with these group agreements. You can use your emoji reaction buttons. You can just use your thumb on screen. I see some thumbs up here and there. Okay, cool. All right. Elmida shares, accepting that each individual is in a different place in this journey of learning and growth. Thank you, Elmida. Yeah. In this series, just to give you a brief overview of what we're covering, I'm going to share this video here.
As a child, I spent several years in the foster care system. I think that's where the seed was planted in terms of advocacy for children and families.
A Native American parent approached me in my classroom to ask how I was going to be able to teach Thanksgiving. This challenged my thoughts and beliefs about how this holiday celebration should be introduced to young children and whose perspectives were included and whose perspectives were excluded.
You are and can make a difference. Join me on this journey, creating a welcoming place for all children and doing better.
So this is basically the intro of our series. And this series is running from this past month, August 2022, all the way until May 2023. And so as part of this series, hold on, folks. As part of this series, we are going to include a few different components. Specifically, we're publishing 4 key articles focused on topics that have research and best practices that you can implement. We're going to be offering 4 webinars, including this one. This is the first webinar with content and discussions and interactive activities. And we're also hosting 2 communities of practice where you and your fellow elderly educators can discuss successes, challenges, best practices, and just reflections around these important points, these important ideas. So, when we have a more complex situation, we can use those communities of practice for that. And Dahlia just shared the series webpage. Feel free to check it out. It's also available in English. And on that note, we really just want to invite you all to continue with us in this journey, starting with this webinar today. And so you can work alongside us. We can have these conversations throughout. And thank you, Cindy, for sharing that. Yes, Cindy's correct. We will not be recording the communities of practice at all. It'll just be a conversation space that's somewhat structured, but so we can really have just enriching, important, challenging conversations. Right, that was a brief snippet about the series. Now, let's see here. Okay, now we're going to move on and let me introduce Peach. So come and meet Peach. And I will go over this briefly. So Peach is a group that we're partnering with. Peach stands for Partnerships for Education Articulation and Coordination Through Higher Education. Peach. And as you might see, we have some folks joining us today. Specifically, we have Dr. Michelle DeJohnette, Dr. Elmida Baghdaserians, and Cindy Stephens. Stephens or Stephens? Stephens?
It's Stevens.
Thank you, Cindy Stephens. And they will be introducing themselves in a moment. And so just to give you an overview about what Peach is, it's a cross-sector, cross-segmental higher education systems initiative. So it's, I would say it's a group of groups in a sense, and Peach really strives to collaborate across different 2-year, 4-year, and graduate level early childhood and childhood development program faculty partners, and as well as different organizations and that focus on professional development programs, professional organizations, and advocacy who are interested in collaborating around the same goals that Peach has. And specifically, they have 3 key priorities. Number 1, they will engage in transformative collaboration with institutions of higher education and agency partners to support and strengthen early childhood higher education system preparation so that your workforce, this early childhood workforce, can be highly effective. Priority number 2, Peach is going to identify and influence, or strives to identify and influence the characteristics of high quality early childhood educational degrees credentials, certificates, and certification. So they're striving to, to make all of the trainings, whether it's these types of webinars or more formal college courses, of high caliber. Priority number 3, PEACH will influence accessible and equitable early childhood higher education pathways for all students, so that no matter how you're learning in your early educator role, it's more approachable for you and your colleagues. And as part of that, PEACH has an anti-racism and equity working group. And so the teammates that we are partnering with in the series are part of that anti-racism and equity working group. And you'll see a few of them in a moment. I'm going to introduce our guest presenters. Take it away, Cindy. Tell us about yourself.
Thank you, Christina. I'm just mesmerized by the diversity of participants here today. I'm so glad you're here. So I am Cindy Stevens, and I have been an early childhood professional for most of my life. And it's been a lifelong journey for me. My passion began as a child who was bullied and picked on for the way that my physical appearance. And so it really instilled in me the importance of having equity and being supportive of all learners. And so my current role as an ECE faculty at College of the Canyons has afforded me many opportunities to share this journey with my adult learners. And I have had the pleasure of serving them. And I'm very hopeful that they pay it forward. And as both Christina and Elmida mentioned, I think that we're all on this journey and we're at different places. And I just want to put it out there that, I've been on this journey for a long time, and I'm pretty comfortable with using words that might make other people uncomfortable. And so I just want you to know that it's coming from a place of just challenging and thinking, and it's not coming from any place of thinking that we all should be at the same place, because that's the beauty of being on this journey. So thanks for letting me be here.
Thank you so much, Cindy. Go ahead, Elmida.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight to share the next 2 hours with us and discussing a very important topic of anti-bias education and anti-racism, and how the adults in children's lives can shape the children's ideologies and the families that we serve. So thank you so much for being here. I just want to give a little bit of a background information about myself. I'm an Armenian American. I was born in Iran. My family immigrated to the US when I was 11 years old. And I always wanted to become a teacher because I wanted to become the one really great teacher that I had in college. Believe it or not, it took that long to have an incredible teacher, but it was so worth the wait. Because of her, I'm an educator today. I've been serving in the field of higher education for 21 years now. And I have been teaching in early childhood for a little bit longer than that. I want to say about 32 years or so, all connected to early education and training adult learners who are interested in working and serving young children and their families. I'm passionate about learning. I'm passionate about research, and I love being a mother. I have 2 children, one 11 and one 15. And every day I'm reminded that the compromises and the commitments that I've made in my life have made a difference in theirs. And now they question everything that happens in their community, in their schools, and they always want justice. And so for that, I'm really thankful. My educational background is in the area of human development and counseling, and I have a doctoral degree in educational psychology. And I'm just very happy to be here this evening. I can't wait to learn from all of you tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Elmida. Go ahead, Michelle.
Hi, my name is Michelle DeJohnette, and as I stated in the introduction video, I experienced some turmoil in my childhood and spent a few years in foster care, and that's really when decided that I wanted to be, first of all, a better parent than I had. And that started my career in early childhood education. I um, had owned and operated a family child care for almost 25 years. And my background is in child development and early childhood education. Um, I was born and raised in San Diego, and that's where I started my career in my education. And now I am a professor in the Early Childhood Studies Department at Cal Poly Pomona. So I'm brand new to this area, and I'm excited to be here and share my knowledge and share with all of you really why anti-bias and anti-racism is a huge component of early childhood education, so that we can make sure every child has access to an an equitable start to their education. And I'm happy to be here with you all.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I feel very, very fortunate to be with you all today as well, and having these conversations. And I see in the chat from what all of you are saying, you're all coming from different scopes of life as well, different roles in education, and it's so exciting. And I see your enthusiasm to learn, your openness, and the dedication you bring to your roles. All right. And we also have with us, if you would like to just briefly say hi, we have Tony Isaacs, who's with the Peach Group, and Jan Fish as well. Today's objectives. What can you expect to learn in doing this webinar? We're going to discuss the impact of bias, especially implicit and explicit bias, and focusing on these terms that you see on screen, including oppression, stereotypes, microaggressions, and anti-bias education. And we're also going to define and discuss intersectionality and how that shows up in our lives and the lives of others. And we will also be explaining the concept and applications of an anti-bias approach, specifically anti-bias education in our programs and in our family engagement practices. And lastly, we're going to get more specific with anti-bias strategies that our programs can use to support families. Right. Now, as for our agenda, a lot of these components are similar to what I shared before in the objectives, but these are the sections, you could say. And we're also just going to get more site-specific in terms of what can this look like in our program, including a discussion where we'll work together in those ways, and resources at the end. And just a heads up, we're going to have a break partway through, I believe around like 7 o'clock. And then we'll have as well some interactive components. As if you know me, we do interaction, not just like listen to us talk for 2 hours nonstop. It's not quite our style. We're also going to be using a breakout room, Mentimeter, and Padlet. In case you are not familiar with those, or if you are familiar, just know that you might be using your smartphone and or another browser in addition to your Zoom application. All right, now up next, Elmida, if you could just get us started over here.
Definitely. Thank you so much. And so before we really get into the main topic of this evening, talking about anti-bias education and anti-racism, it is really important to all of us here tonight that we lay the ground rules or understanding so that we are all working on the same page and having knowledge of the key terms. As shared earlier, we wanted to make sure that we were presenting information to you with this, having the terminologies, understanding of them, as you mentioned in the little poll that we just did. We realize you've heard the term bias before and you have a pretty good idea what it means, but we also wanted to just revisit and review bias, attitudes, or stereotypes that favor one group over another. And really, the bottom line, as an educator and as a parent, that something that I always like to share with my students and in my home with my own children and family members is that we all have bias because we've all lived and have had experiences. And so it's important to own that and understand that there's nothing wrong with the fact that we've lived and had experiences, and that may have shaped the way we see things or experience things. And so those attitudes or stereotypes are things that we need to become more aware of. So we all have biases because we were not raised in a bubble. And the bottom line is how we deal with those biases that we may have, right? So do we talk about how do we deal with the attitudes and the stereotypical ideas that we may have had through the experiences of our lives? And so understanding that this is a reality. Next term, implicit bias, involuntary subconscious thoughts that may influence decision-making and or actions. And so the main thing that that comes to my mind when I think about implicit bias is this idea that we may act or behave in certain ways, and we're not even really aware of it. And so that's what we mean when we say implicit bias. So the unknowingly, right? Excluding or leaving people out of groups or activities without even really realizing what it is that we're doing. And with explicit bias, conscious, intentional attitudes or beliefs about a person or community based on negative feelings. And so knowing exactly what a person is saying or doing. Really intentionally leaving people out or intentionally not wanting to be inclusive. So explicit bias, that's our definition for that particular term. We have several other terms, I think, on the next slide, or sorry, same slide. A term that is very important in the kind of work that we do with children and families is this having an understanding of the term oppression, a set of policies, practices, traditions, norms, definitions, and explanations which function to systematically exploit one social group to the benefit of another social group. So the way that I like to talk about the term oppression, and having done a lot of research in this particular area with social justice and having read many books, specifically Paulo Freire's book about oppression. The Pedagogy of Oppression was the book that that I was first introduced to in my undergraduate program at Pacific Oaks College. Understanding that groups of people who oppress other groups of people because they want to feel better about themselves, because they want to have the power. And so oppression is really the opposite of empowering groups and individuals, right? So taking away what is theirs, their voice, their power, their opportunities to make decisions. So oppression, understanding this term is really important with the information that we're going to be sharing tonight. Next slide, please. Stereotype, an oversimplified image or idea of a particular type of person or thing, or making what is true for a small group of people and generalizing it to be true for the entire community. It's really important that as teachers, we understand what the meaning of stereotype is, because we may have very good intentions in wanting to be inclusive in our classrooms, whether you're working with young children, elementary school age, high school, or college, without being stereotypical. Not all Armenian American families have rice with their dinner. This is something that my daughter said to me one time. She said, "Mom, all the dishes that we have has rice in it." And I said, "Lily, not everybody enjoys the rice the way we do, right?" And so this is maybe a very silly example, but I think it's important to recognize that as we share about where we come from and what our belief systems are and how we do things in our homes with our families, that we're not creating stereotypical ideologies about what all Armenian Americans do. And so when my daughter, who's now 15, came to me several years ago and she said, "Mom, I want to share something from our culture in my classroom," I said, "Well, Lily, let's think about how we can do this so that we're helping your friends learn more about our culture and background without creating stereotypes." And I remember we had this beautiful conversation about, well, what does that mean, Mom? So you don't want me to talk about being Armenian American? You don't want me to talk about the fact that we went to Armenia and I got to see my motherland? And I said, no, not really. That's not what I'm saying. I want you to be who you are. I want you to be proud. I want you to share. But I want you to really be aware of not creating stereotypes so that others can understand and respect our culture and background, but at the same time, not have this narrow view of what all Armenian Americans are, right? So that's my example for stereotypes. And I want to talk about microaggression, everyday slight and insults that minoritized people endure and that dominate people don't notice or concern themselves with. These hidden messages serve to invalidate the recipient's group identity, to question their experience, to threaten them, or to demean them on a personal or group level. And so this particular term, I think it's important to remember that subtle hints are what we're talking about. So folks are not using terms or saying things that are really, explicit biases, but there may be stereotyping or discriminating or using prejudice in talking about certain groups of people. Microaggression. And we'll have some great examples later on in our presentation as well. And lastly, anti-bias education, which is what the main focus of this evening's presentation is. Anti-bias education is an approach to teaching and learning designed to increase understanding of differences and their value to a respectful and civil society, and to actively challenge bias, stereotyping, and all forms of discrimination in schools and communities. And so learning how to be inclusive, learning how to create and respect and understand differences, but in a way that is not stereotypical, in a way that is not prejudice, but still inclusive, is the key component of an anti-bias education. Next slide, please. And so anti-bias education has four main goals, and we wanted to share the four main goals with you because I think this also helps with the rest of our presentation this evening. Goal number one, identity. Each child will demonstrate self-awareness, confidence, family pride, and positive social identities. Goal number two, diversity. Each child will express comfort and joy with human diversity, accurate language for human differences, and deep, caring human connections. Goal number three of anti-bias education is justice. Each child will increasingly recognize unfairness, have language to describe unfairness, and understand the unfairness hurts. And goal number four, activism, which is what we're doing here tonight. Each child will demonstrate empowerment and the skills to act with others or alone against prejudice and or discriminatory actions.
So part of when we talk about bias, when we talk about bias and when we talk about identity, right? There is a concept that we want to introduce the concept of intersectionality. And what intersectionality means is that we all have different identities, right? And sometimes we have often we have overlapping identities, right? And where those identities intersect is what we call intersectionality. So for example, I am Black. I'm also a woman. So we know that in our society, when we talk about oppression, when we talk about gender bias or racial bias and oppression, those are two identities where my experiences intersect. I'm not only do I experience sometimes discrimination and definitely racism and oppression as a woman, right? And then I also experience those things as a person who identifies as Black, right? And there are also other identities. If, for example, my intersectionality could include being Black, being a woman, being a person who has a physical disability. And so intersectionality really speaks to how one would experience all of those different things, sometimes in different ways, sometimes it all at the same time, right? And so this video we want to share kind of really shows a more visual illustration of what we mean by intersectionality.
Intersectionality. Have you heard this word before? Even if you have, you might not know what it means. Let's take a look at it. The first part's easy enough. Intersection, a place where things come together. Intersectionality refers to the reality that we all have multiple identities that intersect to make us who we are. It also gives us a way to talk about oppressions and privileges that overlap and reinforce each other. This term dates back to the 1980s and legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. She noticed that we didn't have an effective way to talk about how the experiences of Black women are different from the experiences of Black men and of white women. How? Black women endure both gender discrimination and racial discrimination. Over the last 30 years, scholars, educators, and activists have expanded the use of the word intersectionality to talk about identities beyond race and gender. Let's look at a few examples. Jerry has a disability, and his family lives below the poverty line. He is the oldest of 10, which requires him to do a lot of caregiving, and sometimes keeps him out of school. No one in the school counseling office has talked to Jerry or his parents about his plans for after graduation. He has applied for several jobs, but never gets called back. Fatima is Muslim and recently came to the United States from Somalia. She finds that many people at her school make assumptions about her values and abilities before they speak to her. Many of her classmates think she shouldn't be at their school at all. Greta comes from an affluent family. Both her parents and grandparents went to college, and her father owns a successful business. She doesn't think about her identity very often, but she does think of herself as someone who will go to college and get a good job once she graduates. Think about Greta's situation as opposed to Fatima's or Jerry's. Fatima and Jerry are members of marginalized groups. They don't get to choose whether or not to think about their identities. Greta, on the other hand, can ignore intersectionality if she wants to. Life isn't the same for everyone, even for people who share identity characteristics. By adopting an intersectional lens, we have a better opportunity to understand why and to change the institutions that help and harm us based on who we are. Want to learn more? Read our story, Teaching at the Intersections, in the summer 2016 issue of Teaching Tolerance magazine.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Michelle, for that. And we hope that that video gives you more perspective. So intersectionality comes down to, as Michelle shared, different like overlapping identities and how, oh, and yes, Anna shares intersectionality is also language. Yes. So there are many, what languages we speak. It also has to do with that as well. Thank you so much. And specifically, one thing that I wanted to highlight about intersectionality is that in having multiple identities that are oppressed or not seen favorably upon by society, we can't assume to know other people's realities. We can't assume to know if their life is harder or easier or anything like that. And it's frankly not our job to judge and decide that. Okay. Right, and go ahead and take it away, Cindy.
All right, so we're going to look a little bit about how the impact of bias in early learning, what is it showing us? What is it telling us? So in the article, if you want to go ahead and flip to the next slide, in the article that accompanies this webinar, we use some examples, and these are just a few of those examples that that show up in early learning environments. You know, the idea, and someone mentioned language, absolutely. You know, the example of racial bias, where we don't incorporate the cultural and racial identity of families, or only focus on one language as opposed to who they are. Skin color. I know that when I was in the early learning space, when I was actually a preschool teacher, I was so excited when we started to get materials that we could use that were skin color crayons, not, you know, they were actually multiracial colors. And so that we could actually talk to children about that. But I still see in early learning environments where the dolls and the human-like toys really don't represent the diversity of children, even if there are only white children in a program, or there are only Black children in a program, or we still need to make sure that we're using all kinds of toys so that children see themselves and see others in their environment. The ability bias, you know, assuming that somebody who, I know that Christina is getting there to flip through it, assuming that someone who may have a disability may not be able to attend and actively participate. You know, Dr. DeJohnette shared, you know, a part of her intersectionality is having a disability. People make lots of assumptions about abilities that prohibit the ways in which we think and that we interact with them. And then sexual orientation bias. You know, there are male children specifically are often made to feel discomfort or have a fear when they're playing dress up, and that when specifically dressing up as what we would typically call clothes for women or girls, which I don't know what that really means anymore. You know, like we do have freedoms to dress in the ways in which we want to, but that idea that a boy dressing as a girl is it lessens their power, right? Because, and there's the racial, I mean, the gender bias that men are more powerful than women. So this is all so much wrapped into some of the ways that we interact, because I want to share a little bit about how thinking leads to action. So the ways in which we think are the ways in which we act. So if we think that there's only one way to raise a child, we may inadvertently have express our implicit bias to a family who may not be the type of family that we think that is a productive way of raising a family. If we question someone's language who is other than English because we think that it's important for them to be proficient in English language, we may treat them in a different way. And I do have an example when I was first in the field, which as an early learning provider, which was like 40 years ago, I remember very succinctly this director telling me not to worry about the children over here because they don't speak English. And so we don't really have to focus on them, which is, you know, the antithesis of what we should be doing, is because we need to support all learners. A lot of these thoughts are unconscious. You know, we're not always aware of them, which is why I think it's so important for us to have these kinds of conversations so that we can bring awareness. I certainly, a long time ago, I watched a video called The Color of Fear, and it was a documentary about a group of men from all different walks of life that were of different ethnicities, shared their experiences. And I'll never forget this one Black man who shared how when he's walking down the street, he sees white women, and he specifically said white women, clutch their purse a little closer, maybe even walk across the other side of the street. This was like in the 80s when I saw this movie. And I had to really look at that and say, oh my gosh, I do that. It was unconscious, and he brought it to my consciousness so that I could make a different choice about how I proceeded in the world. So, we may think that we are using anti-bias ideas, but our actions may demonstrate something else. Something that I find a lot with my students is they'll say that they don't see color, they treat everybody the same. And we're actually going to have a webinar about that, about how that isn't really possible to not see color or to treat everyone the same. And I think that comes from a place of wanting to be accepting, but it also can be dismissive, because we need to see the people for who they are. And part of their identity is how they see themselves. And I liked when Michelle mentioned that identifying as Black, because she could also identify as African-American. She could identify as, maybe she's biracial. I mean, there's all kinds of things that we don't know about Michelle just looking at her. People get to choose how they identify. We don't get to identify for them. And sometimes we do that when we're not conscious. So through this awareness, we can bring our consciousness to the surface. And that can help us to create these equitable relationships when we can be not hurtful, but honest with wanting to come from a place of inquiry and not a place of judgment. And oftentimes what happens is that in America is that we usually look at the lens of ethnocentrism, and meaning that there's just one way to be. And we know that in America, that tends to be the white, right? White, we center whiteness because we do, and it's not actually accurate at all. And this brings me to the point of where Elmida said that she didn't want her daughter to go to school and to create these stereotypes about Armenian, right? Because each Armenian family has its own identity. They might share some similar things, but they also have their own identity. You can't identify somebody based on one aspect of them. And I will tell you that I am someone who identifies as queer. I am married to a woman. And people tend to want to identify me as being a lesbian, and I don't identify that way. That's not who I am. And so that is marginalizing my identity. And I think it's really important that we listen to what the people that we're working with tell us. So we're going to share a little bit about some research findings that are printed. And children notice and pick up biases and biased behaviors from an early age. It shows that, they absorb the stereotypes they see. They become very aware of social labels, status, and biases shown by their family, and not only by their family, but by society, by the school, by the teachers. They're very aware. White children may subconsciously learn that their race holds a privileged status compared to others, and non-white children may learn that their race does not. And a quick story. When my daughter was in 3rd grade, they used to separate the children who spoke Spanish and the children that spoke English. And then they integrated them like once a day. My daughter's 33. So this was, way back when the dinosaurs roamed the earth. And what happened was one day I was walking my daughter into school, and one of her friends was walking by me, and I asked her friend if that was her classroom. And her friend looked at me, this 8-year-old, and said, "That's not my classroom. That's for the Spanish speaking children," as if I had just totally, insulted her. And it just showed me how segregation is harmful as well, because she thought that child, and this is the funny part of it, and not funny, but the interesting part is that she was really being raised by someone who spoke Spanish. Both her parents worked outside of the home, and her primary caregiver was her Spanish caretaker. So it's insidious, and children notice it and they adapt to it just as easily as if we taught them love, right? If we could just teach them about love and acceptance. All right. Next slide. I'm trying to go fast because we're a little short on time. We know that children as young as 3 months are aware of racial differences, and by the time they are preschoolers, ultimately it impacts their choices based on race, about whom to play with and how to play with that person. My own daughter, I adopted her from Korea. Both my children are Korean born, and we always told her she was Korean. And when she was about 15 months old, we're at the grocery store. And I mean, I didn't really know that she really absorbed it, but when she was about 15 months old, we were walking down the aisle and she was in the cart and there was a woman that was Asian and really loud. She says, "Look, Mom, a Korean." So, she knew she's being raised by a white mom, but she knew that being a Korean meant what that woman looked like. So they adapt very quickly. So a children's idea about their own race and other races are formed during early childhood, regardless of whether the topic of race is directly addressed, completely ignored, or actively suppressed in their classrooms. And then the next part that I just want to share with you is that there are very few children's books, or actually there are getting to be more, but there are very few children's books that are published about Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And here is from 2021, some of the latest findings that we found. I will tell you, if any of you are interested in writing books, this is a great space to be in, because we need more books that are true representations, not stereotypical representations of all children and families. So that's it for me, and I think it gets passed on to Michelle and Christina.
Actually, on that note, we wanted to share this great video with you all. It's around 6 minutes or so, but we actually want to prioritize our discussion panel time. So Dahlia just shared the video in the chat, and we encourage you to check it out later on after this webinar. It's a great video that is exactly in line with what we're discussing today. We really encourage you set the time aside to check that out. Maybe watch it tomorrow and share it with your colleagues. All right, we've had our break and now we're moving on. Michelle and I will be talking about our efforts, our anti-bias efforts as individual early educators. Michelle, is there anything you want to share to kick off this section?
What I think is important when we talk about anti-bias education in all aspects of early childhood education, and that could be, in a preschool, in a childcare center, in a family childcare home, in any type of environment. When we're talking about young children, we mean a child from age 0 to 8 years old. And so, we know that children at this age are being cared for in many different contexts, right? So when we want to think about when we're doing our own work to create an anti-bias environment for young children, we must start with ourselves, right? We have to understand that it's a journey, right? And pat yourself on the back for just beginning that journey, right? We want to learn, unlearn our own biases, realize that we have them, as Elmida said earlier, we all have them, and there's nothing wrong with having bias. You can't not have bias because of all of our socialization and what we've learned growing up. But we want to make sure you understand, though, is that we take our bias with us and we want to acknowledge them so that we can understand if our biases are informing any type of prejudice or injustice in our work with children and families. We want to learn language and behavior when we're speaking to children, when we're teaching, when we're talking to families, that we want to make sure that we're being inclusive, right? We're being equitable, and we are understanding that many communities, many people are marginalized for different reasons, and we want to make sure that we are committed to justice for all children and families. And give yourself grace. Again, this is a journey, and the process takes time, the learning, the unlearning, the learning a new language. I remember very early in my career in the 90s, I started when I started learning about how many times we say, we give directions in the negative, right? We say, stop doing that, don't do that, those types of things. And it takes a long time to really try to remove those words from your vocabulary and speak in a more positive direction. So now when I see many places and many times when people say, don't forget to, it always comes to me to say, let's change that to a positive, can you remember to, those types of things. So it's a journey and you give yourself grace. And when we're learning about different identities and different cultures and those types of things, when we're learning about gender bias, we're learning new terms, and sometimes you're going to make missteps, and that's okay. Acknowledge where you are. And we have to reflect on our own identities, right? We really need to think about where we are and who we are and how we were socialized and how the stories that we've been told, the books that we've read, the things we've watched on TV, the things we've heard our parents and grandparents say, all of those things are part of our identity. And really, we can start to think about how some of those judgments and stereotypes might have been formed, right? But who we are comes with us wherever we go, right? So you bring your identity to the table. When I teach, I am a college professor now at Cal Poly Pomona. When I do research, I bring who I am as a Black woman, as a Black scholar, as a researcher in anti-racism and equity, as an early childhood educator. All of that is part of my identity as a mother, a soon-to-be grandmother. That's all part of my identity, and I bring that with me when I'm educating, when I'm speaking with anyone, when I'm working with children, when I'm teaching, whether I'm teaching young children or my college students, right? And then think about, as part of your self-identity, who's in your circle? Do you have experience with people who don't look like you? With people from other cultures and backgrounds, different experiences? That's where the learning happens, right? That's where you can start to break down those stereotypes, right? That's where you can learn that, not all people who look the same eat the same foods or listen to the same music, or not all people who are over 50 are, have problems with computers, that some things are nuanced and we can't put everyone in the same box. So how much time do you spend with people who don't look like you? If you took a picture of your village, how diverse is it? Does everyone look the same? Does everyone work in the same type of career? Those types of things. So that's how we can really start to do our own inner work before we can, really bring that to our early childhood environments. So here's some questions you might want to ask yourself. Do I nurture and construct a really a self-identity group in myself, like I just described? Look at who you spend your time with, and is there some opportunity for growth there? How do I'm sorry.
Sorry, I do want to, for this first question, it's also like, how aware are we of our self-identities and how confident are we of our personal identities and our group identities? Like in my case, coming from a Latinx background, coming from a Mexican American background. Go ahead, Dr. Schultz.
Yeah, exactly. If you're uncomfortable with your identity, if you're uncomfortable, for example, as Cindy stated, if let's, for example, you identify as a person who's queer and you're not comfortable in that identity, it might be difficult. You might have some bias there, right? Just because you're uncomfortable with your own identity, and that might come through in your acceptance in your teaching of young children and families. how do you foster critical thinking about bias? Do we look at things from different perspectives? Do we really think about how things have been done? What comes to mind right now is gender bias. When we talk about, for example, there are many teachers who would tell a little boy, you can't put the princess dress on at dress up time because you're a boy, you know? And why is that? Is that because that's what you were taught? And that's what we know about boys are supposed to, you know, play in this area or do this or dress this way, and girls are supposed to do this and dress this way. But let's think critically about that, you know. When these labels that we've always had, like Cindy said earlier about girls' toys and boys' toys and girls' clothes and boys' clothes, yep, that's the way it's been taught. But is there a way that it could be different? Can we reimagine these gender stereotypes and really critically think about how we can change those ideas and our own biases because of what we've been taught, and maybe things can be looked at in a different way? Do you stand up for yourselves and for others when it comes to bias and when you see injustice happening? Elmida?
I was just, as you were sharing beautifully, Michelle, what came to my mind is just in my own home setting, right, with my family, I take on a role of the nurturer, the caregiver, the take it, you know, I'm in charge of everything. I need to do everything, right? Just, you know, and I'm an educated woman who has her own career and everything, right? But in my family and growing up, my mother took care of everything. And whether it was the laundry or cooking every day, you know, the children's academic progress, their lives, their personal interactions with other people. So I find myself overworked many times because I wear, I have different identities in one person, right? So like I have my professor hat, I have my Armenian mother hat, I have my Armenian American friend hat, and being a good colleague hat, you know. So there's all of these, many times I find it so challenging because I feel like there are so many high expectations of what I do in one day because of all of the expectations. And it's really hard for me to help you know, my family members understand that there's only so much I can do, right? And I feel like my culture plays a very big role in that, because growing up, I saw my mother do it all. And so I do it all, which means that my husband many times sees me doing it, so he doesn't have to do it, right? Even though we have, actually, he's a college professor too. So we have similar, you know, almost the same jobs. And, you know, the heavy, you know, responsibility, making sure, you know, we're doing everything for our kids. But I just find that helping my parents understand the generational differences, you know, in the ideologies, and understanding how I can still be an Armenian mother and still be a faculty member and still do, you know, work that I'm passionate about, like activism, can all be done. But anyways, I just wanted to share that.
Thank you so much, Mia. I think you're sharing, I think you're sharing what similar, if not the same, perspectives as many of us here. One of the main reasons we wanted to include these questions is because this inner work that we're taking the time to talk about, this is pivotal. It's super uncomfortable sometimes, honestly. Whether you do it in a group or alone or wherever, it can be very uncomfortable because it's hard. And and you decide if you want to do it or not. No one else is going to force you to do it. And so we share these questions so that we can reflect as individuals. And many of you are asking, are we going to get these resources? Hands down, yes. You know, we share resources. Don't worry about that. That's going to come to you in different ways. But these questions, we bring them to you all so you can consider this is what needs to happen internally before we can go into the external part. Because oftentimes, especially in the webinars that you come to with us with PSLA, you learn some cool content, some reflection parts, and then we go with okay, go. What ideas can we do? What can we implement in program? What can we do with families? But when it comes to anti-bias and anti-racism and just more equitable practices, it's not going to stick. It's not going to really change anything if we're not also working on the inside. It's not going to work the same way. And it's easy to think, well, I did, check off a list of I did cool known practices, but if we're not reflecting and changing as well, then we're probably going to continue causing harm. Unintentionally or not, we're going to continue causing harm.
Absolutely, Chris. Absolutely, Christina. You will. It is definitely, this work is definitely not more. It's definitely more than what you do, right? It has to be who you are, and this is something that I learned, as a professor. I have shared with my colleagues, in classes that I've taught, when we talk about these different topics that might be a little difficult for our students, for early childhood educators. And I've asked myself, as in my own reflection as a professor, is it my job to change your pedagogy, change your teaching practice? Or is it my job to change your mind? And I, have come to learn that if you are just checking the boxes, as Christina said, then it's really not going to, it's not going to work in the classroom. That this is about a journey of learning and unlearning, and it shows up in all different areas of your life, standing up for injustice, for equity, to dismantle racism has to be an active part of your life. And that's what shows up in the classroom and when we're talking to families in general. And some of the challenges that we may ask ourselves, again, are individualized, right? We have to ask ourselves, what are some of the stumbling blocks that I keep running into? What are some of the challenges that I'm having when it comes to feeling comfortable with my own identity and really understanding that some of the things that I've learned throughout my life might be harmful. Some of the things that I have said might have been harmful in my teaching practice, and that is okay. Like I said before, you give yourselves grace, and you stumble, and then you keep moving forward. And that in the last question, what are different ways for you to develop these goals? Like I said, not just in your work life, but in your personal life as well. Sometimes we interact with people, with friends who might tell racist jokes, or, might have some bias when it comes to gender, might exhibit some homophobia, those types of things. And it might be difficult for you to address that, or tell your friends and family, that's not something I agree with, or that's not the way I like to talk, or things I want my child to hear in my home. We actively work against those types of statements in our life. And that is really what anti-bias and anti-racism means. It's more than just not being biased. We can't not be biased, but really understanding our biases. But to not be racist is really to be anti-racist is an act, it's an action in our lives, you know.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Yes, and I really appreciate how we're sharing, especially in the chat from Andrea and Crystal and Cindy and Elmida and Veronica. I really appreciate everyone's conversations. I encourage you to keep checking in there and discussing.
Absolutely. This chat is blowing up, isn't it?
Yes. And so now I'm going to share some resources. And remember, in this case, you know, this inner work journey, this is a choose your own adventure approach. So we're sharing a few resources. And I invite you all, as I'm sharing on the slides, please share in the chat what TV shows, podcasts, you know, books, articles, authors, whoever, like who have you learned from when it comes to bias and just more equitable practices, how to create a better world. So I'm going to keep sharing, and I invite you all to keep sharing along in the chat as well. We're going to be capturing these resources and sharing them back to you after the webinar. So we are a little bit behind, and I want to get to our discussion sooner than later. So some resources that can support your journey: reading, watching, and listening to books and media around these topics. So I'm sharing a few here, and Dahlia is going to be sharing these links in the chat if you can. So one here is this specific episode from the Cult of Pedagogy, Uncovering Your Implicit Bias. This is an exercise for teachers. We also have different social media pages. I personally learn a lot from Instagram when it comes to, you know, self-care, equitable practices, bias, racism, therapy, trauma-informed care. I learned a lot from Instagram, and obviously try and make sure they're credible resources. But I share some of these because I know sometimes this is the way that works for us. It's just very digestible, you know, and there's no wrong way to learn. So those are some resources there. I also want to share Layla Saad's podcast, Becoming a Good Ancestor. Layla Saad is the author of Me and White Supremacy, and personally, she's had a very deep impact on me, so I really recommend checking out her podcast, or the book itself, Me and White Supremacy. And just like, honestly, her work is what inspired me to know my purpose, and my purpose of, I want to be a good ancestor. I want to make the world better for myself and for those around me and the future generations. And I also want to share these resources here. Explore other tools and resources that help you figure out what biases and prejudices you might have, including Harvard's implicit bias tests. Talia, if you could share that, that'd be great. So Harvard has a series of different bias tests, depending on different identities, including age, gender, race. There's several other tests. I want to say they have at least 10 different types of tests. And I took one of those tests, and I found like, oh, I do have an ageism bias. I do. And that was something that I was vaguely aware of, but with the test, it's like, okay, this is something I want to work on, reflect on. So that's one example of a tool that you can use. And Dahlia shared that link. Thank you for sharing that from Harvard. Okay. Other resources: attend webinars, trainings, etc. on these topics, like the one that you're in right now. This is a great step. Thank you for being here. On that note, Dahlia, if you could share this one, Project Ready. So this is a free online professional development series, and I am duplicating myself because I have resources to share later on as well. But basically, it's a 27 modules offered by originally for librarians, but there are several webinars, several modules that just apply for microaggressions, bias, racism, just different topics. And Dahlia, can you share the Harvard link one more time and just name it the Harvard Implicit Bias Tests? Thank you, Crystal. And in general, when it comes to the inner work, I invite you all to take a pause and reflect during difficult moments or conversations around bias and identity or identities in your work. What are these moments signaling to us? What does this moment mean? What might be coming up inside? And so those moments of discomfort, those are oftentimes like invitations to pause, maybe journal, reflect, like, what is going on inside? Why am I having a difficult conversation with this colleague or this child or this situation with the family? anti-bias practices in our programs, we're going to discuss specifically anti-bias education, and we're going to try and bring it home to both FCC and center-based programs. It could be more relatable, and trying to get more specific to our sites. Go ahead, Michelle. You're muted. You're good. That doesn't change on Zoom.
Right. So when we think about what does this look like in our program, right? How, we have all this great information, and then you might be wondering, so I don't know what to do, right? How do I bring anti-bias education into my learning environment? And what we want to make sure is that, first of all, do all children and families have a sense of belonging in your program? Are they represented? Do they experience you affirming their identity and their culture, so that they know that they belong there and they're welcome, and they're welcome there in your program? We should understand that all children have access to participate in the education that they need, right? Because our goal is to make them successful, right, in their education, and feel like they are worthy of all the opportunities, right, that are available to them. And we include their whole community in their learning process, and that includes their parents, grandparents, whoever their village is or is included in their learning process. And that looks different for many people, depending on who the caregivers are in that child's life. And all the families are given the resources that they need. And that could mean, whether they need some extra support or outside resources, whether it's just our interaction with them via newsletters or whatever parent engagement practices we hold. Are we giving them the resources they need and in the way that they need them? We may, for example, email and our newsletter to all the families, but there might be families who don't have a computer at home, or they may need a paper copy or things, those types of things. So those are ways that we can create an anti-bias environment. Next. So again, when we're creating policies and procedures in our programs, we want to make sure we include the families that are in our program. If we have families that speak different languages, or English is not their first language, or are more comfortable reading in a different language, are we sharing that? Are we sharing information in the best way for them, right? Welcoming their culture and their identity. How do we engage in ongoing professional development? This is something that anti-bias and anti-racism in education is something that can't be learned in a one-time workshop. It's an ongoing process. Like we said, this is a journey of learning. And so we need ongoing professional development in order to make sure that we are growing as individuals and educators, and that this is reflected in our program practice. We want to be responsible, right? We want to make sure that we're engaging families in the best way we can. Oops, I'm sorry. And we talked about including language. We talked about parent-program communication. And one thing that, in my experience, I've learned as a caregiver, and especially as a family child care provider for nearly 25 years, is, again, this learning new language, right? And when children's actual development is happening. In this example, we're talking about toileting and diapering. One thing that was interesting to me is that many families have different names for our private parts, right? Or we don't want to talk about these things, just like we don't want to talk about race and skin color in early childhood environments. In my experience, what I've taught providers as I've coached them is that we just talk about parts of our bodies. We talk about toileting and going to the bathroom, just like we talk about anything else. We kind of take that taboo out of those types of things when we just, that people have penises and people have vaginas and people have elbows and knees, and and when we just talk about things in a very matter of fact way, and we take all the bias and judgment and the "ooh, you said a bad word" type of thing, children really get it and they really understand. I had anatomically correct dolls in my program, and I remember one parent saying, "Michelle, what's teaching these children?" And I said, "I'm not teaching them anything. They were born this way." It's just part of life, and our bodies is part of that, taking away all of the bias in as far as our identity is concerned. I'm going on to the next slide. Yep. As I shared, we want to talk about accessible family communication. Language is important. Different modalities is important. Are we talking to our families about what their needs are? If we have people, like I said, who don't have internet access or don't have access to hardware, they need us to print a copy of the school calendar or the newsletter, those types of things. Sometimes we kind of get used to, "Oh, I'll just email you," or, or we can have a Zoom call, and we have to make sure we're talking to families about what their needs are. Are we scheduling parent-teacher conferences in an afternoon when parents are working? Sometimes we can have a judgment about parents' interaction in their school, in their children's learning. And just because we're not thinking about, are we making that time accessible for them? Holidays is a huge one when we're talking about inclusion in families and those holiday celebrations. And again, are we marginalizing people or are we including everyone? I'm trying to go quickly to Christina.
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Michelle. And so I'll bring it home here in terms of interacting it with our programming and with families in general. What we also want to consider is how we are presenting families and how do they show up in our programs. So aside from obviously having a welcoming environment, are we also just welcoming them in the representation? So the pictures that they see on our bulletin boards and our newsletters and our emails, the stock photos that we use, for example. So if we have a certain percentage of Asian families, Latinx, Native American, Pacific Islander, Black, etc., do we show pictures of those types of families in our program? And if not, can we make those steps or have pictures of the families themselves if they feel comfortable doing so? This is something we've talked about before in our families, culture, diversity webinars and other the DLL webinars as well. And so it's not necessarily new if you've been to one of our webinars before, but also just using the terms that identify families inclusively. So if you notice, okay. So if you attended our webinar or have seen the online course on family welcoming all types of families or creating a program for all types of families, we also want to discuss and be mindful of what are we saying parents or are we saying family members? In my case, I use family members because that's what we try to be all encompassing. And so that can include foster parents, aunt, uncle, older sibling who might be caring for them, or it can also be just a looser term for family, friends of the family who are other mothers or who are have different care roles that are not biologically related as well. Because we don't know what families' realities are. We don't. And so in moving away from more terms like mom and dad, maybe using family members or caregivers can be more inclusive. And in general, that shows up as well in like programming, like we mentioned in the previous slide. And so specifically for your program, I invite you all to discuss with your program what specific situations occur in your sites, specifically around bias and race, and what supports or training do you need? What practices might you incorporate? And also focusing particularly in strategies that support Black, Latinx, Native American, Asian, and additional families of color. We want to get realistic about the situations that they experience. And maybe you don't have the answers, but if you can recognize and have an awareness of the situation, go out and search for the resources. And we are happy to help you connect with those resources, including, for example, Brazelton Touchpoints shares specific training series on supporting families of Latinx background, families of Black families, and LGBTQ families, Native American as well, and several other different types of families. Classroom environment and interactions. So specifically, are we making sure that our curriculum connects children to different learning topics related to their community needs and their individual cultural needs? So I'll bring you back to the Dual Language Learn Initiative with like our visuals being representative, our terms that we're using as well. And in general, how can we incorporate families' cultural diversity in our programs, especially in pictures, in toys, in books, in music, and dramatic play, and partnering alongside families in that process. You don't have to do this alone. You can work with families and have them be part of that as well. We have some folks in the chat sharing about parent communication, definitely using real pictures of families, not just necessarily staged ones. Melanie shares about reading books about single families or same sex, definitely. And we definitely have some resources around those topics in an earlier time. So we really appreciate your time and presence today. If you have any questions, email me. We are sharing these resources and the future reporting, and we look forward to seeing you in our future trainings. Peach colleagues, what would you like to share? Any final thoughts?
I just put in the chat that I want to give everyone applause, and I hope that they give themselves credit for just beginning the journey. That's where it starts. And you're here because you care about children and families, and we appreciate you.
Definitely. Thank you all.
Michelle couldn't have said it any better. And it's just an honor to be able to sit here with all of you and to hear your experience and your strength and what you're doing. And the fact that you want to be here on this journey is just so remarkable. So thank you. And I hope that some of you join or all of you join our community of practice, because that's where we can have deeper conversations.
Thank you, everyone.